Did you know The Poetry of Reality is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other audio podcast platforms? I like to think I have a good audio face.
If you're watching this on YouTube, you might have noticed that this episode is a week delayed. If you want to get early access to our episodes, consider becoming a paying member. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you for all your support. This autumn, I will be on a tour of North America and parts of Western Europe, talking about my latest book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, a Darwinian Reverie. I will be joined on stage by a range of friends and foes. The book is aimed at the same audience as The Selfish Gene, but the content is quite different. Beginning on September the 4th, I'll be visiting Dallas, Austin, Newark, Washington, Boston, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, probably San Diego and Los Angeles, then San Francisco, Portland, and Vancouver. Then, returning across the Atlantic in October, I have events in Oxford, Coventry, London, Cambridge, Glasgow, Salford, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Dublin, and Belfast. The events will include a Q&A and a limited meet and greet. You can get your tickets at richarddawkinstour.com. I first encountered Lawrence Krauss sometime in the early 2000s. It was at a conference. I'd just given my lecture and was answering questions at the end when a rather small man with a rather loud voice and a much more than rather high level of articulate fluency stood up and started berating me in what I thought was a rather aggressive manner. Actually, he wasn't being aggressive, but if you're used to people waffling round in circles, if somebody stands up and speaks clearly, to the point, and in whole sentences, it can sound more aggressive than it really is. Anyway, I sought him out in the bar afterwards, and we had a good discussion. It was, of course, the distinguished physicist and public intellectual Lawrence Krauss. Shortly afterwards, we pursued our friendly disagreement in the pages of Scientific American. This was back in the day when Scientific American cared about science. Since that time, I've interacted with Lawrence on stage probably more often than with anybody else. The recording that follows was made at Stanford University sometime around 2007. I like to think it's a good example of how two people can have a fruitful public discussion without a chairman and not in a debate format. As for the nature of our initial disagreement, I won't rehearse it in this introduction because it forms a good part of the discussion itself. I hope you enjoy it. Well, I suppose I must bear some responsibility for the fact that we don't have a chairman sitting between us. I'm trying to pioneer a new method of public conversation in which we have a chairman to introduce us, a chairman to stop us promptly when we've gone too far, and I hope he will do that, I hope Mark will do that, but not a chairman to actually moderate the discussion itself, because I'm sure this wouldn't have happened with Mark Kay, but in my experience, having a chairman on the stage between two conversationalists spoils the conversation, because just when it's getting going, the chairman will change the subject. It's even worse when there are, say, 4 people on the panel, and there's a good conversation going between person A and person B, and just when person B is about to retort to person A, the chairman will jump in and say to person C, and what do you think about this? And that completely derails the entire thing. Another thing that's even worse is the debate format. 20 minutes for the proposition, 20 minutes for the opposition, 5 minutes rebuttal, 5 minutes rebuttal. It's all derived from lawyers. Like so much else. So that's just my introduction to the format. In a way, apology. It throws an onus upon us to keep the conversation going, and so we're going to do our best. Lawrence.
Well, the other thing we want to let you know is that, as Mark alluded, we've already had a rather public dialogue that appeared in Scientific American, and actually an extended version is online, and I encourage you to look at that. But we also therefore decided that we would not try and reproduce that dialogue here because it's accessible to you. So we've assured that would be the case by making absolutely no preparations whatsoever for this event, and that may or may not be obvious. We'll see. But I'm going to begin by asking you, Richard, about your own philosophy about education. What drives your interest in public education and the techniques you use?
My job is Charles Simoni Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford. And the benefactor, Charles Simoni, explicitly wanted me to promote science to the general public, rather than, for example, do research on how many people think the sun goes around the earth, or how many people don't know why we have a winter and a summer, that kind of thing. I mean, that's very interesting research, and you'd be shocked by the results.
In fact, well, absolutely. In fact, you should know that 50% of the American public, every year the National Science Foundation has asked this question, do not get the answer right to the question, the Earth goes around the sun and takes a year to do it, true or false? And as I like to say, we know who that 50% vote for, but in any case, but anyway.
There's a similar 50% who think that the world is 6,000 years old. And as I've said before, if you actually work out the scale of the error, it's equivalent to believing that the distance from New York to San Francisco is 7.8 yards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, as I was saying, the Charles Simoni Professor of Public Understanding of Science could devote himself or herself to, I say himself or herself, I'm retiring this year, and so my job has been advertised, and looking forward to seeing who gets it. It could have been devoted to that, or could have been devoted to, say, teaching how to communicate science. But the benefactor asked me to do it by promoting science. I think there are two main ways of thinking about science as an educationist. And I can illustrate it by talking about two approaches to space. There's the Carl Sagan approach to space, which is the sort of, isn't it wonderful? And that's my approach. And then there's what I call the non-stick frying pan approach, which is, oh, we must support NASA because non-stick frying pans were developed as a byproduct of... and that's an extreme, but nevertheless, when I'm asked to justify science education, I do not, as some people do, leap first for the, oh, it's useful. For example, why preserve the Amazon rainforest? Oh, because we might be able to get drugs from the bark of trees. Maybe we can, but that's not why I want to preserve the Amazon rainforest. So I'm the Carl Sagan, the wonder of space, the beauty of the universe, the awe-inspiring nature of deep space, deep time, of deep complexity in biology. I don't go for exploding custard, whiz-bangs, and things like that.
Well, okay, that's a really good point you pointed out, because my area of research is in something that, in all fairness, has absolutely no practical utility whatsoever. And the thing is, I'm often asked to apologize for that, and it is interesting to me that people ask, you know, what's the point of doing that if it's not useful? But they never ask that, or very rarely do they ask that about art or literature or music. It's not, those things are not going to produce a better toaster. And for me, I have to agree with you completely that the most fascinating thing about science is the ideas, is the lifting of the human spirit. And we remember the Greeks not for their plumbing, or the Romans not particularly for their plumbing, but largely for their ideas. And why we have to justify that when we talk about science amazes me. And there's a quote that I like to use from the first head of the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, which is a particle accelerator. Right now, in fact, it's the most energetic particle accelerator in the world, soon to be surpassed by a machine in Geneva, as may be many things about this country. And he was asked to testify before Congress, and he said, they asked him, would this aid in the defense of the nation? A typical thing. And he said, no, but it'll help keep the nation worth defending.
Yes.
Okay. And I think that's really important. Yeah, well, you can applaud for he's unfortunately deceased, but I'll let him know that you... But the other thing, though, that I have to say behind my philosophy of reaching out and I know we have talked about this before a little bit. I believe in trying to explain the wonderful and mysterious nature of the universe, which is far more mysterious and interesting than any science fiction writer could ever come up with. But in order to get people to be receptive to that awe, I think you have to do a little work. When I, for some reason or other, get asked to talk to teachers a lot, and I tell them that I think the biggest mistake that any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. Now, it's actually true. It's true for, it doesn't have to be a teacher. It could be car salesman, politician, anyone. I really do think you have to work and reach people where they are before they'll even be receptive, because they won't understand how it relates to anything they're interested in. So when I'm trying to reach people about science, I try to go to where they are in some sense, or work very hard. And that was the purpose behind the Star Trek book, for example. People, I think as a biologist, maybe you have this happen less to you than I do as a physicist, but when people ask me at a party, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a physicist. And then they say, well, how about the baseball season? And
I'm shocked. I'm horrified by that.
Yeah, I know it. It's true. But then you say, well, what about time travel or something like that? And then people realize they're fascinated by those ideas, but they don't make the leap and realize in some sense that that's science, that the things that intrinsically fascinate people are really the things that we're lucky enough to be able to, in general, be paid to do. And so I think one has to try and find a hook. And as I say, in biology, you may not have found the hook, although the hook, in this case, one of the big interests, of course, is evolution, and it's kind of an anti-hook nowadays. And at least in the United States, the fact that evolution is so fascinating as an idea, and I think, by the way, that we physicists are also largely to blame in many ways for the fact that Darwin isn't appreciated more than he is. We did a wonderful public relations campaign for Albert Einstein, but I have to say, as I, over the last few years, have spent time in the public debate about evolution versus intelligent design, I really do think that if I had to pick the greatest scientist of the last few hundred years, it would be Charles Darwin and not Albert Einstein. That a single person could so radically change an entire field, and combining observation and theory just amazes me. And we really should be promoting what a remarkable human achievement that was.
Well, I think that is right. One way to put it is that the ratio between that which a theory explains as the numerator and that which you need to assume in order to explain it as the denominator, Darwin wins out on that. I mean, what Darwin explains is everything about life: human life, animal life, plant life, the diversity of life, the complexity of life. Everything is explained by one simple idea. It's an idea so simple that you can express it, actually, I think, in a single word: heredity. Once you've got, on a planet anywhere in the universe, high fidelity replication of coded information, I think everything else then follows. You'd probably need to add a little bit more than that. On the other hand, when you compare the achievement of an Einstein with a Darwin, and a Newton with a Darwin, I think you need to be a lot brighter to be an Einstein. I mean, any fool could have been a Darwin. It's interesting. Let me clarify that. It's somewhat baffling to me why we had to wait for our Darwin until the middle of the 19th century, 200 years after we had to wait for our Newton. You would think that the idea of evolution by natural selection could have occurred to any philosopher in an armchair from the Greeks onward. Not one of them got it. Not a single one of them got it.
But I think that, for me, it's funny that you say that. Maybe the grass is always greener on the other side, but I think as a physicist how much harder it would be to have been Darwin. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, and I realized I couldn't, partly because classification was not, when I grew up, biology was classification, unfortunately. And I realized that that's just something I couldn't do very well. And I think, well, you probably know more about this than I do, but observation was such a key part of what Darwin did that I don't know if, of course, after the fact, anyone could have had the idea. And one says that about many things in science. After the fact, it's a lot easier to understand where it came from. But having the idea, I think Darwin, it's so beautiful yet so subtle that his expedition on the Beagle and all the years he spent observing things was an essential part of ramming into the skull of someone who, after all, evolution is everywhere, but at the same time it's nowhere. It requires an understanding of cosmic time in a way that is essential to understand what's here and now. And of course, the same is true about, in some sense, astrophysics. But the fact that many people are comfortable thinking about the cosmos in grand scales, but thinking about our own selves in that way and understanding. I mean, one of the big problems of people understanding evolution is this realization that the Earth has been around a hell of a long time, and so has life. And without that cosmic time, the concept of evolution would clearly be wrong.
Yes, you have to be able to grasp the immensity of geological time. It's interesting, by the way, that Darwin was almost scooped by Alfred Wallace, and both of them, they were very similar. They had very similar careers. And they were both naturalists. They both traveled the world. They both spent a lot of time in the tropics, alone, free to think. Wallace actually had the idea in a fever dream. In a moment of lucidity in the middle of having a high fever with malaria. I love that story. I mean, I love the thought that it took a kind of fermenting high temperature in a brilliant man's brain to get this idea.
It'd be good to know what other thoughts you had at the same time.
I know.
But
Yeah,
anyway, sorry.
But nevertheless, the idea, when you grasp it, as you say, it is very simple, whereas Einstein and quantum theory, you no doubt understand them. I don't, and I bet most people here don't understand them, because it seems to me to be much further from what the human brain is set up to comprehend. I mean, perhaps we ought to talk about that, actually, but maybe not now. But
yeah, it'd be fun to talk about that a little bit. I think I'd agree with you. Certain things like quantum mechanics, no one understands. We do it, but we don't understand it. And that's vitally important, I think. There's certain things we will never have an intuitive understanding of, and it probably relates to evolution. It probably relates to the fact that we're classical beings, and the way the world behaves at a fundamental level is just something that we have no direct or even, no direct experience of. We can try and build up an indirect understanding, but it works. But it is so counterintuitive to realize that at a fundamental scale, objects are doing many things at the same time. Whereas you and I
going through two slits, for example.
Yeah, going through both slits at the same time, or a lot more than both slits. And we exploit that. And as I say, maybe we'll talk about that. But the interesting thing is, I guess, that to me, it's not so clear that at least evolution, and well, you get mail, I get mail, and it's obviously not intuitively clear to many people that what evolution is. I was telling you just before this, I got a letter last night because I was doing something that happened to be on TV from a woman who said to me, well, okay, I don't know if she said she liked watching me on TV, but she said she did. But she said, now, I just want to know one thing. Who decided which ape would evolve and which wouldn't? But I think that's the kind of immediacy people have, and the confusion people have with evolution is a sense that that's exactly how it works, instead of working with populations. And so it is, this beautiful idea is still one step removed from our direct experience. And I think that's one of the reasons why, just one of the reasons why people are so many people are so abjectly opposed to it. It appears to go against what their direct experience. I think there's much more to it than that, but.
Ernst Mayr, the grand old man of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, who died at the age of 100 a couple of years ago, he put it down to essentialism, the modern name for what people like Plato, I mean, one could call it the dead hand of Plato. Essentialism means people think there's an essence of rabbit, an essence of rhinoceros. A rabbit is a rabbit is a rabbit, and rabbits have the same sort of eternal verity as triangles to Euclid. And I mean, maybe all the Greeks like that thought like geometers.
Yeah.
And so a rabbit was a thing which kind of hanging out there in space, the ideal rabbit. And so the idea of a rabbit evolving into anything else, or an ape evolving into anything else, is utterly foreign. But it seems to me that that's a different and much smaller order of foreignness than the idea of a particle going through two slits, and in some sense knowing whether I forget what you have to explain the thing.
It's absolutely ridiculous what particles do when they go through two slits. It's,
yes.
No, I mean because well, okay, we'll do this now. So when I throw a baseball, I'm a big baseball fan. When I throw a baseball, it takes a known trajectory usually, and ends up in a catcher's hand. And we can calculate that, and we force students through endless, boring calculations to calculate that. But when you throw an electron, of course, it doesn't do that. It does everything at once. It takes every possible way to get from one place to another, all at the same time. And we can demonstrate that with a wonderful experiment that actually was first performed by someone who was both a doctor and a physicist, Thomas Young, and who also. It's amazing what they did then. He also was one of the people that was essential in decoding the hieroglyphics. But an electron, when you send it out, and there are two slits, will go through both at the same time and interfere with itself when it comes out the other end, and therefore produce a very strange pattern on the other side of the slits. Now, if you say, well, look, this is ridiculous. The electron either went through one slit or the other. So I'll watch it. And you turn on a light, or an electron detector, and you watch it, and indeed, each electron goes through one slit or the other. And you say, aha, but then you look behind the slit, and when you're watching it, the pattern is different. Having watched it, having measured it, you change the pattern, and so you know it was doing something very different when you weren't watching it. And that is very objectionable. And in fact, Einstein never, as you know, never came around to accepting that as a fact of life. And it is truly one of the strange, relativity is much simpler to understand. Quantum mechanics is profoundly unnerving because of that, and it has many philosophical implications that many people are still disturbed about. And we're trying to understand, in fact, my own field, something I'm just working on, involves trying to understand if the universe is quantum mechanical. What does a measurement mean? Because if you're an external observer turning a light on an electron, then you can understand that you might affect it. But if the universe as a whole is a quantum mechanical system, which it surely is if quantum mechanics governs it, then what does it mean if you're inside of it? And one of the pictures that people use to guide themselves now, which is called the many worlds interpretation, which is just ridiculous, is that every time I look out at you, I force you to be in a specific configuration, just like that electron. But there's an infinite number of other universes that are existing at the same time in which, one of you is up here and I'm in the audience. And they're all coexisting at the same time. And so every time we make an observation, this quantum wave function of the universe branches into an infinite number. And it's just, and that infinity keeps multiplying. And it's probably the only classical way to understand what's happening, but it's so ridiculous that I think that most people wouldn't accept, and I'm not sure most physicists accept it.
You say it's ridiculous, but I mean, so is the alternative ridiculous. I mean, it's almost as though you need a ridiculous theory to understand this ridiculous observation.
Well, actually, that's a good point. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's actually.
Well, if you take the Copenhagen interpretation of the, say, Schrödinger's cat.
Yeah.
It's completely ridiculous, but then so is the many worlds interpretation completely ridiculous.
Well, that's what's great about quantum mechanics, is every interpretation is completely ridiculous,
yes.
I guess. Yeah.
Well, we got into this by comparing it with Darwin's achievement, and however you might say there's a certain foreignness about understanding Darwinism, you've got to get your mind from a timescale of seconds, minutes, years, decades, perhaps centuries, which we're quite accustomed to. You've got to switch to hundreds of millions of years. Well, that's difficult, but it's not difficult in the same league as the quantum difficulty.
And that brings up something interesting, which is that, so you mentioned quantum theory. And so we don't have people going to schools and demanding that it's a theory after all. And
only a theory. Only a theory.
Yeah, it's only a theory after all. But somehow, when it comes to evolutionary theory, people say, "Well, it's just a theory." In fact, I was just about to tell you before, during the stage before we came out, an amazing thing that happened. It's a wonderful thing that happened. I don't know if you're aware of the news in Florida. Every now and then, something good comes out of Florida, and so there was a big fight about introducing evolution in the schools, and in fact, eventually the legislature or the school board agreed to allow evolution to be, in fact, require evolution to be introduced, but with the statement, the scientific theory of evolution. And the people who had agreed to that, of course, were the people who like to say, well, good, now the word theory is there, and we can make it appear to be suspect. But the great thing that just happened, and I'm just so thrilled with this, is that the school board said, okay, but we are also requiring it to be called the scientific theory of electromagnetism, the scientific theory of quantum mechanics. And so now, finally, it's put on the same, people can understand that when, in science, when you use the word theory, it's very different than when we use it in common parlance. So it's a great success, although it was meant to be.
Yeah, that's very good. But let's ask the question, why has evolution especially suffered from this? Because, I mean, is it because people think they can understand it? I mean, Jacques Monod, the great French molecular biologist, said the curious thing about natural selection is that everybody thinks he understands it. And they clearly don't. But is it that because people think they understand it, and therefore their skepticism is aroused, where they don't even, they know they haven't a prayer of understanding quantum theory, so it doesn't, I mean, just it's off the radar, and so they don't express skepticism about it?
I think it's more than that. I think there's an immediacy of evolution because it puts humans on the same, at some level, as all other animals, and we're going to be bound to get to this, so we may as well start now. I happen to think really evolution is a straw man. It's really the attack on evolution, in this country at least, and I think largely elsewhere, is based on a fundamental fear of science. A fear that science is immoral because it doesn't explicitly mention God. Because God is not an explicit part of our discussions. And because God is not an explicit part of our discussions, therefore, it must be immoral. And and that's why all these people are not so much trying to attack evolution per se, as to say what we want to do is, in fact, have a theistic understanding imposed upon science classes so that scientific materialism, which has led, if you look at the literature of these people, has led to all the evil things in the world, is now turned into a moral subject. So I think it's this immediacy that it's the biggest slap in the face to some people.
Yeah, but why wouldn't physics have that same effect?
No, because I think it's not so personal, which is one of the reasons why I think many people are more intimidated by physics, is because it's not so personal. Biology, I think it's one of the reasons biology is taught first in high schools, which I think is a huge mistake. And in fact, me and a physicist named Leon Lederman have been working to trying to get physics taught first, not because we like physics better, but because the reason maybe one of the reasons I'm not a doctor is that, you know, I was taught biology and I had to memorize all this stuff. But in fact, of course, physics is the basis of chemistry, and chemistry is the basis of biology. So if you really want to understand biology at some level, you should understand things like energetics and
yes.
mechanisms. And so I think, but the reason biology is taught first, I think, is that many people feel, because it's about things you can see and touch and immediate things, it's much more intuitive and much more friendly. But at the same time, it's much more terrifying to, in some sense, for some people, to say that humans are on exactly the same plane at some level as every other animal that's ever walked across the earth. And for you, and you'd say that's a good thing, that it attacks that belief that some people have that humans are special and different. But for those other people, they'd say that's why science is bad. It shouldn't attack that because we are divinely inspired and God has created us in her image.
Within biology...
It's all right. That was pandering.
Okay,
that was pandering. It's okay. Don't.
Within biology, the order is wrong as well. Evolution is taught last, at least it is in Britain. And so many people get to the end of their biological education never having learned about evolution. That means they learn all about facts, just like you did as a doctor when you weren't becoming a doctor. Yeah. They learn all about lots and lots of facts, lists and lists of facts, and not the slightest inkling of the explanation. And the explanation has been with us for 150 years, 149 years, and it should come first, because otherwise you're learning facts without any rationale, without any sense of what it's for. And the rationale is so beautiful and so elegant, and actually so easy to understand, I think.
Well, let me ask you in this regard to that, because would you... are we making a mistake by calling evolution a theory? I mean, evolution is a fact. It's natural selection, perhaps, is a theory.
If you look up the word theory in the Oxford Dictionary, you'll find two main definitions. One is the only a theory one, as in it's just a hypothesis, nobody knows for sure, it's just a theory. The other one is a body of knowledge which is coherent and which is taken to be factual, which is taken to be factual until maybe something better comes along. But so the theory of gravitation, Einstein's theory, quantum theory, and evolutionary theory. And clearly scientists are using it in that sense, whereas lay people, eagerly egged on by unscrupulous creationist propaganda, are taking it in the hypothetical sense.
So you're comfortable calling evolution a theory? I mean, it seems to me if I look around, the facts of evolution are obvious, but the question whether
I would call it a fact. I think that we're playing the wrong game by using the philosophically sophisticated term theory. Since the other side is playing the game of using the colloquial term. The colloquial term for what evolution is fact.
Yeah.
It is a fact.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I'm all in favor of that.
It's a fact in the same sense as that's a table.
Yeah, exactly. Or the Earth goes around the sun.
And if you're going to get sophisticated and philosophical, no doubt it's only a theory that that's a table.
Yeah. Exactly.
There are sense data pouring in which so far have failed to falsify the hypothesis that that's a table. And in the colloquial sense, if ever the word fact should ever be used, then it's used of the fact that that's a table, and it should be used of the fact that we are that we share a common ancestor with monkeys, that we share a common ancestor with sea squirts and starfish, and bacteria. That is a fact in the ordinary language sense of a fact. Now, natural selection is a theory for what has driven evolution in adaptive directions, that for what has put together the powerful illusion of design, which nobody could fail to notice. It's not the only thing that drives evolution. I mean, much of evolutionary change is driven by random genetic drift, by the so-called neutral theory of molecular genetics. But natural selection is the only theory that's ever been proposed, and I think that ever will be proposed, that's capable of accounting for the illusion of design which we see around us. So I'm not quite sure whether... Darwin thought that both natural selection and evolution itself were theories in the tentative hypothetical sense, and he spent most of his life gathering evidence for them. I think now we've reached the point where the fact of evolution is a fact, and nobody could seriously doubt it. There is still controversy over the theory that natural selection is the dominant driving force. I think nobody would doubt that it's the dominant driving force of adaptive evolution, but many people, including me, doubt that it's the dominant driving force of all evolution as measured at the molecular level.
Maybe we'll get to that too, because I wanted to ask you about in this country, there's these fake controversies that have been invented in a lot of different areas, but particularly the people at places like the Discovery Institute and elsewhere have tried to put forward. It's this beautiful. I got into probably publicly talking about this in this country when in Ohio they were about to introduce the requirement in some sense that intelligent design be taught alongside evolution. And there was a debate that the Board of Education set up down in Columbus before the public and the board, and I was asked, just because I'd written something about this in the paper, asked to be on this along with another scientist who happens to be a religious biologist, Ken Miller, and then two members of the Discovery Institute. And we all thought that, I mean, I agree with you, by the way, not only do I not like the debate format, but in science it's actually very disingenuous.
Yeah.
Because first of all, it doesn't happen that way most of the time, but secondly, it gives the impression, and I'm sure you've had this, a lot of people want to be on stage to debate me about evolution or about alien abduction or whatever it is, because if you're reasonably presentable and your arguments are interesting, someone who's out there in the audience who doesn't necessarily know what's happening will come away from it in the end saying, well, he said, she said, it sounded reasonable on both sides. And so at that debate, I made it quite clear at the beginning that this was not representative, that if it had been representative, there would have been 10,000 scientists on one side of the table and 2 representatives of a wacky fringe group on the other side of the table. But it's very important. But we thought that they were going to get up and say, you know, all the reasons why intelligent design should be taught. But they're really brilliant, and they have much better marketing than scientists do for the most part. And one of the slimiest of them, who happens to be a philosopher, got up and a rather intelligent man, he said, you know what? We don't want to force that. We're open-minded. We don't want you to require you to teach intelligent design. We just want you to teach the controversy. Now, what a brilliant statement. That was the first time it was used in this country. And it's brilliant because, of course, it's like asking, you know, when did you stop beating your wife? I mean, you can't, the minute you say it, it presumes there's a controversy, and it's brilliant because most people in this country believe that evolution is incredibly controversial, and in fact, I don't know if you know one of these statistics, it's really scary. If you ask Americans, and this was done in a poll last year, forget that most Americans don't believe in evolution, at least when asked about it. That's true. By far, the majority don't believe in it. But they were asked, if, independent of what you believe, what should be taught in schools? Okay? 12% said evolution only. 24% said creationism only. And the rest of Americans were, you know, like to be open-minded, teach everything. So it's much scarier, in fact, than you might think otherwise.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? I mean, by the way, there are all sorts of creation myths that you could teach. I mean, you could have hundreds of different ones. I mean, I think maybe one way to retaliate is to say, well, let's teach the controversy about reproduction, and let's have equal time for the sex theory of reproduction and the stork theory of...
No, exactly. No, in fact, that's perfect. And I think that's what, I mean, that's an example of what, when we talk about science education, which is what you try to do. Let's bring this to an example that people can internalize and respond to. And in fact, I use the same example. In this country, there's, you know, people, it's really resonated because people think we should be open-minded. But when I point out, well, look, in that National Science Foundation survey that I talked to you about, 50% of the American public does not know the Earth goes around the sun and takes a year to do it. So therefore, in physics class, if we're worried about being open-minded, and half the American public doesn't believe that, in physics classes, shouldn't we spend equal amount of time on the Earth-centered cosmology?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
And when you put it that way, people realize that's clearly nonsense, and it brings home the key point, which is that the purpose of education is actually not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it.
Yeah.
And so if we're and that's the onus on scientists. If people don't understand these things, it means we're doing a bad job, and we have to do a better job. It doesn't mean we should do a worse job. And I think all of these things do reflect the fact that we as scientists, obviously you and I spend a lot of our time in one way or another trying to counteract that, but we as scientists are not doing a good job at explaining what we're doing or why we're doing it. And so I guess let me ask you a question, because one thing, you know, when we've compared our different techniques and of trying to reach people, and you know, I've argued that I have some problems sometimes with the approach you've taken, because I think well, I have had some. We can talk about that, and maybe we will. But the point is that if we continue to alienate, as scientists seem to do with the public, then we shouldn't be surprised if they don't support science. And so the question is how to overcome that. And I wanted to ask you the following question: which is more important to you? Disabusing people of false notions, or convincing them to try and learn about the real things?
I'm always getting this problem. It's
I know, and that's why I brought it up.
Yeah. It's this matter of seduction and...
which is a word I've used with you, and I get incredible trouble because of it.
And I had a little exchange with Neil deGrasse Tyson at the Beyond Belief conference, and he took me to task in very much the same terms as you have. I suppose in the particular case of the evolution-creation controversy, where I have been accused of rocking the boat and of spoiling the case for our side in the education debate, it was put to me most starkly by Rothschild, who is the lead lawyer for our side in the Dover, Pennsylvania case. And we had lunch together, we got on very well, and we talked a lot. And then at the end he said, well, thank goodness we didn't call you as an expert witness. And he was absolutely right. I would have been a disaster as an expert witness, because the lawyer for the other side would simply have said, Mr. Dawkins, is it true that you came to your atheism through evolution? And I would have had to say yes. And then he would have simply have said, my case rests, because that's enough to damn it. So the seduction technique there would be to go out to people and say, look, I respect your religion. I think your religion's great, but your religion is perfectly compatible with evolution. And you can believe, if you like, that God set evolution going. Maybe God helps evolution over some of the difficult jumps,
I don't know. So I don't think. Obviously, I have been accused of the seduction side, and which I'm proud of. But I think the point is that you have to. You don't have to go bend over backwards that much. But I think that the largest impact I've ever had is going to fundamentalist colleges and saying just simply the simple statement that you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution.
Yeah.
And that is so. I've had kids come up to me and say, I've never heard anyone say that. I always thought you had to.
How could they possibly not have heard anyone say that? Did they ever talk to a clergyman, a bishop, an archbishop?
The clergy. No, you see, this isn't the Church of England. This is. No, it's true. These kids, every Sunday, from the time they're too young to think, and that's why both you and I absolutely agree that I think it's sort of child abuse to subject children to that. But they are told that. They are told that in this country, and that is why many of them just have this gut reaction, because if I have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, I clearly am not going to believe in evolution because it's a threat to my belief. But if you just tell them it doesn't require that, then it is eye-opening and useful. At the same time, I think it's disingenuous not to point out that there are tensions. And our mutual friend Stephen Weinberg, another physicist, has put it, I think, most eloquently by saying science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God.
Yes. Well, I want to go further than that. I think that, as you were talking then, I thought I could put it exactly the other way around. You can go to these people in their churches, fundamentalist churches, and you say, look, you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. Now, if your aim is to propagandize in favor of evolution, that obviously is the best seduction technique. But if your aim is to kill religion, as mine is, then just let me finish. If your aim is to kill religion, then since evolution is manifestly true, then if there are people out there who really believe that if you are an evolutionist, you've got to be an atheist, then all I've got to do is to persuade them of evolution, which should be comparatively easy, since the evidence is overwhelming, and I'll turn them all into atheists.
Yeah. That would okay. But here's why. I was thinking about this last night, comparing our different approaches, which a lot of people have compared in different contexts. But I really think the reason, actually, I've come to appreciate much more than I had before your approach in the times we've interacted, which really is one of raising consciousness. You've said that many times. Yeah. And I really think that is vitally important. And my own consciousness has been raised by you in many ways, and not just in the times we've talked, but in your writing. But I think, I don't think you're convincing many people to be atheists. What you're doing is convincing people who are receptive to those ideas already not to be afraid to have those ideas in public, which I think is very important. So in some sense, I think we're speaking to complementary groups. At some level, the resonance, the number of copies your book has sold, I think is an example that you're really reaching people who are sympathetic, but in some sense needed ammunition and an understanding and a coherent picture of this. And so I think that the approach you're taking works extremely well and is vitally important for those people who are receptive. And I guess the approach I've tried to take most recently is the approach for people who aren't receptive, and that's seduction.
Yeah.
And that's to say, and the end result may be hoping that they might think one way or another about God, but it actually isn't. It really is hoping that they'll open their minds enough to realize that the real world, the world as it actually is not evil. It's neither good nor evil, but it's remarkable. And the way to understand the physical world is to use science. And so I think we're really actually speaking at different audiences. I'm not convinced. In fact, I'm pretty convinced that, and maybe you can give me counterexamples, that the confirmed, deeply faithful probably resent and close their minds to what you're saying so early that you're really not turning them around. What you're doing is a very important task, which is to point out that, look, there's a large body of the American public, and it may be a minority, but it's a bigger minority than many individual religions that actually don't believe in God. And it's about time that politicians understood that. And in fact, this really came home to me during this presidential election, and one of the reasons I've been trying to get this debate to happen, with which, and I'm pleased to say Richard's wearing one of our pins, as I'm wearing one of his. But that when Mitt Romney gave this speech, which was supposed to be the equivalent of a speech that John Kennedy had given many years earlier about separation of church and state, and his speech was exactly the opposite. In fact, the speech basically said, there is no room in the state for those that don't go to church.
Yeah.
And
doesn't matter which church you go to, as long as you go to one.
And for that, it's vitally important that you raise the consciousness of the media and politicians and of individuals that there are a large bunch of people who don't believe in God, and they're not bad, they're not worse, they're not anything. And so it's vitally important, but I do think we're speaking to different audiences, and I wanted to see what you thought.
I think that's fine, and maybe that's the right way to go about it. I mean, there are these two audiences, they both need speaking to. I think I compared it a couple of days ago to the good cop, bad cop.
Exactly. My wife, who was in the audience, says it's the first time I've ever been called a good cop. So.
Well, I was the bad cop until Christopher Hitchens came along. And
well, you know, so what? Actually, so do you think Christopher Hitchens goes too far? I'll put you on.
He's one of the most eloquent people I've ever heard.
Yes.
He has a thrilling voice, like Richard Burton. I'd hate to have him on the other side of me in any argument. If we ever talked about the Iraq War, I'd be on the other side of him.
I've tried. It's very difficult.
And I wouldn't wish that. No, I don't think he goes too far on anything else apart from the Iraq War. I think.
Okay, so really you don't. Okay, this is interesting because.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you, but I was under the impression that we talked about one of my favorite lines in his book, which I really shouldn't say in a public forum, but I will.
No, we don't. Okay.
No, you don't want to go there.
I know what that one is.
Read his book. But it is an interesting line, and I'll be happy to.
Okay. Good.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Okay. Which is where he discusses what he says. What he says is the motto of the Roman Catholic Church, which is "No child's behind left." And okay, now are you sorry you asked? But you don't think he went too far with that?
Well, with that line,
But okay, let's bring it back because I know we're actually going to be getting ready for the question period in a minute from everyone else. But this symposium is about education in some sense. And it's interesting to me that you said that you really, your purpose is to destroy religion. Is that really your purpose?
No.
I don't think it really is.
It was an interesting piece of contrarian reasoning to what you were saying, because you were saying you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, and that of course is exactly. I mean, then I tell people to go and read Ken Miller, Francis Collins, and indeed any reputable clergyman. But if a larger view is that the presence or absence of a God in the universe is I mean, that's a huge question. I think it's a scientific question. I have a view on it, and I try to raise consciousness about it. Then, if it's true that there are lots and lots of people who think that evolution is incompatible with religion, and I actually do think it is, you see. I actually do think it is. But even if I didn't, if I were a propagandist trying to destroy religion, I would seize on that. Because it doesn't follow that because there are people who think that that if you believe in evolution, you've got to be an atheist. Therefore, the obvious conclusion is to say, oh, no, you don't have to be. I mean, you could do it exactly the other way around and say, yes, well, as a matter of fact, yes, you do have to be an atheist if you believe in evolution. And here's all the evidence for evolution, and you can't get away from it. Well, of course, that wouldn't go down well with Ken Miller or Francis Collins. But I could come back and give good arguments for why I think there actually is an incompatibility.
Yeah, well, sure, absolutely. But would you really have a hope of success if you're working against something that's instilled in children from the time they're very young, and it doesn't go into their brain, it goes somewhere else? So that
Probably not.
I think if you say to people, and I think it's an interesting idea, but if you say to people, yeah, you have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, you're not, because of that, because faith is so emotional, you're not going to get past that point, I think.
Well, I think that's right. And as a matter of fact, I do recommend Kenneth Miller's book to any religious person who writes to me. And so that's your answer. I mean, I do, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I mean, and I knew you did. And I think that, I mean, presumably, well, let me ask another question, maybe near the end, but and then you can ask me one at the end, I guess. But, when you were writing The Selfish Gene, which is your first book, I mean, the purpose was to explain the remarkable aspects of evolution. It probably had nothing to do with religion at the time.
No, of course. I mean, my main purpose is science and the education in science. I suppose there's a slight difference in that I do think the existence of God is a scientific question. I'm not one of those
totally
I don't go along with Steve Gould on that. I mean, I think it is a scientific question.
Well, and in fact, I've argued in this country that plays into the hands of people like the Discovery Institute who try and claim it's a scientific question.
Yes, I know.
And but I think that and this is probably where we both agree, and maybe it's a good time to go to the questions, unless you have something pressing you want to ask me. You wrote The Selfish Gene, and I've written my books because we find the real world so amazing. That it'd be better if more people knew about it. And I guess, and part of my reason there is somewhat the same as yours, are not so much focused against incorrect beliefs, but I actually think the world would be a better place if we were willing to understand, just accept it for what it is.
Absolutely.
And without fear and without terror, and that would, if that governed public policy, just to say, well, public policy and our life will be based on accepting the world for what it is, without preconception and fear, then the world would be a better place.
Absolutely. I couldn't, I mean, I can't disagree with that. My whole life has been devoted to explaining science because it's wonderful. I mean, here we are on this planet, and maybe the only planet in the universe where there is anything capable of understanding why it's there. Our brain may be the only object in the entire universe that has the capacity to understand, to internalize the universe in the sense of setting up a model of the universe. So it is an amazing privilege to be alive, to be capable of understanding, to be alive in the 21st century, when understanding of the universe and of life is far, far greater than in any past century. We should make the most of that, and those people who are deprived of the opportunity to learn about how wonderful reality is, it's simply tragic that they should go to their grave missing out on the opportunities that an understanding of science, not the practice of science necessarily, not Bunsen burners and things, but understanding the scientific method and understanding what an enormous amount is known, and the challenge of how much is not known.
Exactly.
And how much there is still work yet to do.
Yeah, and we give people the impression that scientists really want to, and in fact, the people use that who are countering science all the time. They say scientists, they have this picture, and it's a story. First of all, that's the first thing they tell about science. It's a story. It's not a story. It's more than a story. It makes predictions, and that's vitally important. But they want to have this little bit of knowledge, and they don't want it to be attacked. when in fact it's exactly the opposite. The thing that drives scientists forward, certainly drives me and everyone else I know, is actually the stuff we don't understand. And moreover, it's not as if we want to always agree with our colleagues, because the way you get famous is by proving them wrong. And that's what you go into work every day, is you want to prove all your colleagues wrong. And in fact, getting back to education, to me, the one thing that I hope every student has at some point in their life, and I tell this explicitly, and I think it's really profoundly important, the one experience that I hope you have in either high school or college or somewhere in your education is to have some belief that you profoundly, deeply hold prove to be wrong. Because that is the most eye-opening experience you can have, and as a scientist, to me, it's the most exciting experience I could ever have.
This is the end of the video version of this episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.